This is going to be the last segment of Answer to Job. I'm reading from Answer to Job by C.G. Jung, paragraph 755. The dogmatization of the Assumptio Marii points to the Heiros Gamos in the Pleroma, and this in turn implies, as we have said, the future birth of the divine child, who, in accordance with the divine trend toward incarnation, will choose as his birthplace the empirical man. The metaphysical process is known to the psychology of the unconscious as the individuation process. Insofar as this process, as a rule, runs its course unconsciously, as it has from time immemorial, it means no more than the acorn becomes an oak, the calf a cow, and the child an adult. But if the individuation process is made conscious, consciousness must confront the unconscious, and a balance between the opposites must be found. As this is not possible through logic, one is dependent upon symbols, which make the irrational union of opposites possible. They are produced spontaneously by the unconscious and are amplified by the conscious mind. The central symbols of this process describe the self, which is man's totality, consisting on the one hand of that which is conscious to him, and on the other hand of the contents of the unconscious. The self is the whole man, whose symbols are the divine child and its synonyms. This is only a very summary sketch of the process, but it can be observed at any time in modern man. Or one could read about it in the documents of Hermetic philosophy from the Middle Ages. The parallelism between the symbols is astonishing to anyone who knows both the psychology of the unconscious and alchemy. Paragraph 756. The difference between the natural individuation process, which runs its course unconsciously, and the one which is consciously realized is tremendous. In the first case, consciousness nowhere intervenes. The end remains as dark as the beginning. In the second case, so much darkness comes to light that the personality is permeated with light, and consciousness necessarily gains in scope and insight. The encounter between conscious and unconscious has to ensure that the light which shines in the darkness is not only comprehended by the darkness, but comprehends it. The filia solis et lunae is the symbol of the union of opposites as the catalyst of their union. It is the alpha and omega of the process, the mediator and the intermedius. It has 1,000 names, say the alchemist, meaning that the source from which the individuation process rises, the goal towards which it aims, is nameless, ineffable. Paragraph 757. It is only through the psyche that we can establish that God acts upon us, but we are unable to distinguish whether these actions emanate from God or from the unconscious. We cannot tell whether God and the unconscious are two different entities. Both are borderline concepts for transcendental contents, but empirically, it can be established with a sufficient degree of probability that there is in the unconscious an archetype of wholeness which manifests itself spontaneously in dreams, etc., and a tendency independent of the conscious will to relate other archetypes to this center. Consequently, it does not seem improbable that the archetype of wholeness occupies as such a central position which approximates it to the God image. The similarity is further borne out by the peculiar fact that the archetype produces a symbolism which has always characterized and expressed the deity. These facts make possible a certain qualification of our above thesis concerning the indistinguishableness of God and the unconscious. Strictly speaking, the God image does not coincide with the unconscious as such, but with the special content of it, namely the archetype of the self. It is this archetype from which we can no longer distinguish the God image empirically. We can arbitrarily postulate a difference between these two entities, but that does not help us at all. On the contrary, it only helps us to separate God from man and prevents God from becoming man. Faith is certainly right when it impresses on man's mind and heart how infinitely far away and inaccessible God is. But it also teaches his nearness, his immediate presence, and it is just this nearness which has to be empirically real if it is not to lose all significance. Only that which acts upon me do I recognize as real and actual, but that which has no effect upon me might as well not exist. The religious need longs for wholeness and therefore lays hold of the images of wholeness offered by the unconscious, which independently of the conscious mind rise up from the depths of our psychic nature. The last paragraph, paragraph 758. It will probably have become clear to the reader that the account I have given to the development of symbolic entities corresponds to a process of differentiation of human consciousness. But since, as I showed in the introduction, the archetypes in question are not mere objects of the mind, but are also autonomous factors, i.e., living subjects, the differentiation of consciousness can be understood as the effect of the intervention of transcendentally conditioned dynamisms. In this case, it would be the archetypes that accomplish the primary transformation. But since, in our experience, there are no psychic conditions which could be observed through introspection outside the human being, the behavior of the archetypes cannot be investigated at all without the interaction of the observing consciousness. Therefore, the question of whether the process is initiated by consciousness or by the archetype can never be answered, unless, in contradiction to experience, one either robbed the archetype of its autonomy or degraded consciousness to a mere machine. We find ourselves in best agreement with psychological experience if we concede to the archetype a definite measure of independence and to consciousness a degree of creative freedom proportionate to its scope. There then arises that reciprocal action between two relatively autonomous factors which compels us, when describing and explaining the processes, to present sometimes the one and sometimes the other factor as the acting subject, even when God becomes man. The Christian solution has hitherto avoided this difficulty by recognizing Christ as the one and only God-man, but the indwelling of the Holy Ghost, the third divine person in man, brings about a Christification of many, and the question then arises whether these many are all complete God-men. Such a transformation would lead to insufferable collisions between them, to say nothing of the unavoidable inflation to which the ordinary mortal, who is not freed from original sin, would instantly succumb. In these circumstances, it is well to remind ourselves of St. Paul and his split consciousness. On one side, he felt he was the apostle directly called and enlightened by God, and on the other side, a sinful man who could not pluck out the thorn in the flesh and rid himself of the satanic angel who plagued him. That is to say, even the enlightened person remains what he is, and is never more than his own limited ego before the one, who dwells within him, whose form has no knowable boundaries, who encompasses him on all sides, fathomless as the abysms of the earth and vast as the sky. This includes my public reading of Answer to Job. It is my intention to begin a reading of Aeon quite soon. Aeon is Dr. Jung's investigation into the phenomenology of the self, which is the second psychic center which is unique to Jungian psychology. I hope you've enjoyed this reading. I've learned a lot.